Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how long you should rest between sets to maximize muscle growth. First and foremost, we need to define what we mean by rest periods so that we know exactly what we are referring to when using the term rest. Essentially, we are referring to the rest taken between each set of lifting, so it would probably be more accurate to use the term interset rest periods. For example, if we perform 3 sets of bicep curls, we may rest a certain duration between each set of curls, and this period between each set is the rest period for that exercise. Now that we understand what rest periods are, let's explore what effect this has on lifting performance. Well, it is fairly intuitive that our rest periods have an influence on lifting performance. If we rest for a longer duration, then we allow acute fatigue to dissipate and lifting performance will be better. In other words, if we rest longer, we can lift more weight or perform more reps in each set. On the other hand, when rest periods are limited, performance will be inhibited. In other words, when we rest for shorter durations, we may have to lower the weight or perform less reps in each set. This study found that longer rest periods between sets not only allowed more weight to be lifted in each session, but also resulted in more strength gains over time. This makes sense because handling heavier loads is more specific for neural strength gains. So it is quite clear that longer rest periods allow better lifting performance, but what impact does this have on hypertrophy? The best evidence we have for the effect of rest periods on muscle hypertrophy is this systematic review from 2017. This review analyzed all studies that compared hypertrophy outcomes when using rest periods of less than 60 seconds compared with rest periods of greater than 60 seconds. It was found that both short and long rest intervals were similarly effective at inducing muscle growth, although there was a trend in favor of longer rest periods. However, one issue with the studies used in this systematic review is that some of them didn't compare resistance training with an equated proximity to failure. Since we know that proximity to failure is an important variable for hypertrophy training, we may need to look closer at the evidence. Let's use an example to illustrate this point. Let's say 2 groups of trainees perform 3 sets of 10 reps at a load of 70% 1RM. Group 1 was given 1 minute rest between sets, and Group 2 was given 3 minutes of rest between sets. Group 1 would be training closer to failure because they are given less rest, while Group 2 would be training further from failure because they are given more time to recover. Therefore, with all other factors being equal, we would expect greater hypertrophy gains in Group 1. Now let's take the same example but say that both groups took each set to failure within the 8 to 12 rep range, and load was adjusted based on performance and fatigue. Now each set is taken to the same proximity to failure, which we know is an important consideration for hypertrophy. In this case, Group 1 would have to use less load on average or perform less reps on average than Group 2 because they would be more fatigued with shorter rest periods. With this study design, we may expect the longer group to grow more. When we look at the individual studies from the systematic review, we generally see this pattern occurring. For example, this study used a strict set and rep scheme with the only difference in the training protocol being rest periods. Like we would expect, the group who rested for a shorter duration saw greater muscle growth than the longer rest group. Whereas in this study, trainees performed the same number of sets with all sets taken to failure in the 8 to 12 rep range. Here it was found that longer rest periods resulted in greater muscle growth compared with shorter rest periods. So while it is not entirely clear if shorter or longer rest periods are superior for growth, it definitely seems like longer rest periods may be more beneficial when we control for proximity to failure. We should also note that we don't have any good evidence comparing moderate rest periods to longer rest periods for hypertrophy outcomes. Most studies compare short rest periods of around 1 minute to rest periods of longer than 1 minute. So it is unclear as to whether resting for 5 minutes, for example, is superior to 3 minutes. There may potentially be a point of diminishing return, whereby as rest periods become longer, there is not much additional benefit. To better understand the effects of rest periods on muscle growth, let's have a look at the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy and how these change with different rest periods. According to this research review, we have 3 proposed mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy: mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. Mechanical tension simply refers to the amount of stress induced by muscle fibers having to contract under load. Metabolic stress refers to the accumulation of metabolic byproducts in the muscle as a result of energy production. And muscle damage refers to the swelling and repair of muscle tissue in response to the micro-trauma induced by weight training. While it is not yet clear if these are the definite causes of muscle growth, these 3 factors have some evidence to all be independently hypertrophic. So how does rest periods influence these mechanisms? This was a graph proposed in the systematic review showing how rest intervals may hypothetically influence the mechanisms of hypertrophy. As we can see, shorter rest periods maximize metabolic stress because there is less time for metabolites to clear from the muscles, but mechanical tension is limited since less weight can be lifted or rep performance will be reduced. Muscle damage trends in the same direction as mechanical tension, as we generally see these two factors correlate. Therefore, different rest periods may potentially induce hypertrophy via different mechanisms. It may therefore be advantageous to implement a range of different rest periods to take advantage of the different mechanisms. So what practical guidelines can we propose from this information? The first consideration is time efficiency. In the real world, we may have limited time to train in the gym throughout the week, so we want to get the most out of the time we have in the gym. It seems that longer rest periods are generally more beneficial for hypertrophy outcomes, but if we rest for a long duration between each set, then it may make each session extremely time consuming. This may mean that if we are time restricted, we have to sacrifice volume for the sake of resting longer. This may be a net negative trade-off because rest periods don't have as significant an impact on muscle growth as a volume does. For example, if we have 10 minutes to train the biceps, we could do this by performing 3 sets with 2 to 3 minutes rest between each set, or we could perform 5 sets with around 1 minute rest between sets. In this case, 5 sets with less rest is probably more effective for the limited time we have. So there needs to be a balance between rest periods and practicality. If we rest for so long that performance doesn't drop at all, we may be making each set maximally hypertrophic, but how much better is it than resting for a slightly shorter time period and finishing your workout in half the time? For example, imagine we had 15 sets of training to complete in a given session. If we rested 5 minutes between each set to ensure performance is maximized, our session would take around 2 hours to complete. However, if we rested for 2 to 3 minutes between each set, we would complete our session in around 1 hour. And how much more hypertrophic is resting 5 minutes compared with 2 to 3 minutes? It probably doesn't have much more additional benefit. So we are halving our training time with only a slight decrease, if any decrease at all, in hypertrophic stimulus. Furthermore, if we want to provide more of a hypertrophic stimulus, the trainee can simply add an additional 1 to 2 sets because they have saved so much time. The second consideration for rest periods is its influence on what systems become the limiting factor for performance. To maximize hypertrophy, we want to ensure the target muscle is the limiting factor of each set. However, rest periods may influence fatigue of other systems and cause them to be the limiting factor before the target muscle. This is mainly a concern with compound lifts rather than isolation lifts. During compound lifts, accessory and stabilizer muscles are working simultaneously, and the cardiovascular system also gets taxed. Therefore, if we don't rest long enough between sets of compound lifts, then performance may be limited by cardiovascular fatigue or local fatigue of accessory or stabilizer muscles. For isolation lifts, this isn't really a concern because they only involve training one primary muscle group, with movement at one joint. Therefore, the cardiovascular system will almost never limit performance before the target muscle, and there are no other accessory muscles working. Therefore, local fatigue of the target muscle will almost always be the limiting factor, regardless of rest periods. So as a practical guideline, trainees should allow enough interset rest for compound lifts so that performance isn't limited by the cardiovascular system or other accessory muscles. Whereas for isolation lifts, there is no minimum rest times because the target muscle will always limit performance. Another consideration for rest periods is its effects on joint health. As we know, longer rest periods allow more weight to be lifted or more reps to be performed, while shorter rest periods limit performance. Therefore, although longer rest periods may be slightly more hypertrophic, they may also induce more joint stress. Whereas if we rest for a shorter duration, we can use less load and still take the muscle to a close proximity to failure and get a similar hypertrophic stimulus. Therefore, if trainees have a history of pain or injury in a certain joint, it may be safer for them to implement shorter rest periods on exercises involving those joints. It should be noted that strict technique and appropriate weekly volume are going to have the most influence on joint pain, and shortening rest periods are an additional strategy to get more relief, not as a substitute. And the last consideration for rest periods is the potential for taking advantage of the different hypertrophy mechanisms. This is not a well-established theory by any means, it is just a hypothetical rationale that may potentially have some merit. So as we mentioned previously, shorter rest periods seem to maximize metabolic stress, while longer rest periods maximize mechanical tension and muscle damage. Therefore, we may be able to take advantage of these different mechanisms by implementing both shorter and longer rest periods for the same muscle group. This may hypothetically promote greater hypertrophy than implementing any individual rest period alone. For example, we may perform bench press with heavy loads and full recovery between sets to maximize mechanical tension, and then perform chest flies with short rest periods to maximize metabolic stress. However, it is unclear if metabolic stress is even a direct driver of hypertrophy, or it is just a secondary mechanism to increase mechanical tension. So we can't make any conclusive arguments for this idea. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.